Elisa Henderson was 37 years old and carried a leather suitcase with worn handles, holding more memories than clothes. It was late summer of 1889, and the train chugged across the dry prairies towards the interior of the country, where time seemed to move slowly, like stepping on drought-cracked earth. Elisa sat by the window, watching the world blur as she left behind a life of broken promises. She had come from Boston, where she had spent most of her life serving in houses that weren't her own, cleaning porcelain dishes she would never use. The newspaper advertisement and Richard's letters had arrived like a whisper of redemption, a simple widower willing to start anew with an honest woman. The letters were tender, full of hope, and a frankness Elisa hadn't known since childhood. He promised her a home, and Elisa, exhausted from merely surviving, decided to accept. The landscape outside became increasingly arid. Fields gave way to tall pastures, and the wide, silent sky seemed to promise as much as it concealed. Elisa didn't know exactly what awaited her, but she had learned to cling more to possibility than to certainty. In the inner pocket of her skirt, she carried Richard's last letter, written with trembling hands, but full of tenderness. He spoke of the cradle he had built for the baby, of the beans planted in April, of the cold nights when he wished for someone to share the silence. He spoke as if he already loved her. Elisa closed her eyes, leaned her head against the window pane, and tried to imagine this man, this home, this new chance. The train continued, heavy and steady, like a premonition, and in that moment, she believed that she could finally belong somewhere. Clearwater Station was nothing more than a sloping wooden platform, surrounded by tall weeds and silences. There was no city noise, no smell of food in the air, no welcoming smile that Elisa had secretly dreamed of. As she stepped down, pulling her suitcase with one hand and with the other, she saw only 7 children huddled in the corner of the station as if they were part of the landscape and had been born there. The smallest sucked his fingers, his face grimy and his eyes sunken. The eldest, a thin boy with grey eyes and furrowed brows, stared at her with a mixture of caution and something that seemed like suspicious hope. There was no sign of Richard. Elisa waited and waited until the boy took 2 steps forward and said without ceremony, "He died 3 days ago." The words cut through the air like an axe. Elisa blinked several times as if she could awaken from that sentence. The boy's name was Noah, and he was 12 years old, but the weight on his shoulders was that of a weary man. He spoke firmly, as if he had repeated it to himself many times. It was a snake. He was gathering firewood. I tried to suck out the venom, but his voice choked for a moment. I couldn't. The other children remained silent, as if they too awaited her reaction to know if they could collapse. Elisa said nothing immediately. She felt her legs give way and sat on the wooden bench next to her suitcase. Her eyes welled up, but no tears fell. She looked at Noah and, for the first time, understood that she hadn't been brought there by a man, but perhaps by a calling. Noah led Elisa to the cabin with steps too firm for someone so small. The path was dirt, lined with fallen fences and twisted trees that looked more like silent sentinels of abandonment. The children followed in single file, like sad ducklings trailing an improvised destiny. The cabin appeared after a bend in the terrain, a wooden structure darkened by time with a sloping roof and holes in the windows covered by dirty rags. The smell of mold, sour milk, and old sadness permeated the air even before she crossed the threshold. Inside, the scene was one of war. Empty pots, a dirt floor, a worn hammock swaying in the corner with the baby asleep inside. Elisa stood still, for a moment, looking at everything as if seeing a broken mirror, each piece showing something of what she herself tried to forget. "There's no more food," said Amelia, one of the twins, her voice so calm it hurt. Lucy, the 5-year-old, held the hem of Elisa's skirt as if she already knew her. Samuel, the 10-year-old, stared at her with narrowed eyes, full of defiance, as if to say, "Are you leaving too?" And perhaps Elisa would have left, if not for the baby's quiet crying breaking the silence, a sound so fragile that it cut through any rationality. She approached slowly, looked at that reddish, hungry face, and something inside her broke. Or perhaps it had clicked into place. Without thinking, she took the scarf from her neck and wiped the sweat from the baby's forehead. When she turned, she met 7 pairs of eyes fixed on her, without demand, without hope, just waiting. And in that instant, without saying anything, Elisa knew she wouldn't leave. That night, Elisa slept, sitting up, with the baby leaning against her lap and Lucy nestled at her feet. The darkness inside the cabin was almost solid, as if time there had stopped, even before Richard's death. There wasn't enough candle, nor dry firewood, nor any illusion of comfort. And yet, as she listened to the irregular breathing of the children around her, she felt something she hadn't recognized in years. Presence. It was a heavy silence, yes, but alive, as if each of those children was a spark resisting extinction. Her own thoughts zigzagged between pain, fear, and a determination that was beginning to ignite, timidly but real. This wasn't the life she had come for. It was another. And even without knowing how, she intuited that perhaps it was the life she had always waited for, one that demanded everything from her, but returned meaning in exchange. The next morning, even before the sun had conquered the dew, Elisa rose with aching muscles and a heavy head, but determined to act. The first thing she did was wash her face in a bucket of cloudy well water, and there she realized that the bucket had holes. The well was shallow, and the water was barely fit to drink. Noah appeared outside with mud-stained feet and sleep-deprived eyes. The water was like this before. Papa tried to dig deeper, but he got sick. Elisa merely nodded and looked around. There was so much to do that her chest tightened. The loose porch boards, the unstitched windows, the piles of clothes stacked like stones, of abandonment. But instead of crying, she took a step, and then another. She picked up an old bucket, tore a piece of sheet to cover the bottom, and said almost voicelessly, "Let's start here." The first few days were a succession of small miracles and exhaustion. Elisa learned by force of necessity to sew curtains from old cloths, to improvise soap with ash and fat stored in a hidden jar in the cupboard, to identify edible roots in the dry yard. Noah was her right hand, tireless and attentive, like a boy who already knew what it was to lose everything. Samuel still looked at her with suspicion, refusing her food, her orders, her care, but he observed everything, as if testing the limits of what she could endure. The twins helped in silence, always together, always moving like mirrors. And Lucy clung to her. She held Elisa's hand as they swept the floor or piled branches, as if saying without words that she was ready to believe again, and that, for Elisa, was a promise more powerful than any signed paper. In Clearwater Village, however, doors did not open as easily. On the 3rd day, Elisa walked there, pushing an old cart carrying some dried corn, a few coins, and exhaustion etched on her face. She entered the general store with her hat pulled tight on her head and her shoulders tense. The owner, a pale man with eyes always damp with suspicion, measured her from head to toe before saying emotionlessly, "Widows with too many children are bad luck. Around here." Others turned away, whispered, crossed the street as if she carried a disease. The promise of marriage, now dead, meant nothing to them anymore. She was just a stranger with a tired mouth and 7 more to feed. Elisa pressed her lips, thanked him anyway, and left with a bag of flour and the bitter conviction that, if they were to survive, she would have to dig deep, deeper than she ever had in her life. That's when Agnes appeared. A woman with broad shoulders, white hair pulled back in a low bun, and eyes like nails, small, firm and deep. She found Elisa at the edge of the village, bent with exhaustion, and simply said, "Can you sew?" Elisa hesitated, then nodded. "Clean well?" Another nod. "Then come tomorrow. I need help, and I have food." Agnes lived in the back of an old house, full of dried plants, stacked junk, and cats that looked like spirits. She was grumpy, direct, but didn't ask too many questions, which for Elisa was a rare and precious form of kindness. In the mornings, she cleaned, cooked, tended the garden, and sewed clothes for Agnes's clients. In return, she would return to the cabin with a basket of eggs, crooked vegetables, and a piece of stale bread. The children waited for her at the roadside, as if each return was a small resurrection. Over time, Agnes began to talk more. About the husband who died in a harsh winter, about the children who moved far away, about the hardship of being a woman in a place where men dictated the rules even after death. "Don't think they'll let you stay," she warned once, chopping onions with steady hands. "This land is marked. Richard owed the graves. They think everything here is theirs." Elisa listened in silence, but her stomach churned. She still didn't know these Graves brothers, but the name hung in the air like a dark cloud. She thought of the children, of the baby who now smiled when she approached, of the twins who sang softly as they washed clothes, of Samuel, who had finally accepted a slice of bread without complaining. She thought and felt fear, but also something stronger, deeper, that had no name yet. Perhaps it was faith, perhaps it was anger, perhaps it was love. The confrontation didn't take long. In the late afternoon of a muggy Sunday, when the sky was the color of burnt iron and the winds brought dust in whirlwinds, the Graves brothers arrived. They rode on dark horses, like bad news itself, dressed in dirty vests and hats that barely concealed the contempt in their eyes. The eldest, Jeremiah, dismounted first. He had a coarse voice, a twisted smile, and a gold tooth that gleamed like a promise of curse. "This place isn't yours, lady," he said, looking at Elisa as if she were a persistent insect. "Richard owed more than he could pay, and now you pay 3 days, or we'll take you out by force." Noah stood beside Elisa, small but whole, like a post driven by his own pain. Elisa didn't answer. She looked Jeremiah in the eyes as one examines a stone, and then just said, "Get off my land." That night she didn't sleep. She sat at the table with an old leather-bound notebook, found days earlier among Richard's things, along with a piece of cloth stitched with the initials E.H., and began to read. The pages were worn, stained, but carried something surprising: Richard's diary. They were simple notes, but full of humanity. He recounted how he saw in his children the only chance to leave something good in the world, how writing to Elisa was his last hope, of bringing home someone with courage and kindness. And there, between soap recipes and wheat accounts, a page written in a steady hand, dated and signed, read, "If I die first, let Elisa Henderson be recognized as guardian and heir to this land and the children, for she is already part of this family, even without having arrived." Elisa touched the almost faded ink and cried, for the first time since she had set foot in Clearwater. With the diary clutched to her chest, Elisa felt a thread of strength course through her tired body. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a recognition, a legitimization of what she was already living with every gesture, every shared meal, every washed wound. The next day, she walked to Agnes's house and told her what she had found. The old woman listened with narrowed eyes, then stood without a word, went into the room and returned with a rusty iron box. Inside, among old accounts and yellowed papers, she pulled out an envelope with the Warren Walker seal. "Richard's brother. I had contact with him years ago. He wrote asking for news when Richard disappeared for a while. He might still be alive. He might care." Elisa took the envelope with trembling hands. She didn't know what to expect from a stranger, but she knew she had to try. She wrote the letter that same afternoon by the faint light of a candle made from fat and string. She told him everything: her arrival at the station, Richard's death, the children, the diary, the threat of the graves. She asked for help, but without begging. She ended by saying, "They deserve more than hunger and fear. So do I. If you have the blood of the man who promised me a home, then come and see with your own eyes." She mailed the letter the next day with the coin she earned cleaning the windows of a village schoolteacher. Then she returned home, her heart oscillating between hope and abandonment. That night she slept embracing the baby and with Richard's notebook under her pillow, like someone guarding a map, even without knowing if there was still solid ground ahead. In the days that followed, life in the cabin took on the rhythm of a silent siege. The children perceived the tension in the air like wild animals sensing the scent of a storm. Samuel began to sleep with a piece of wood hidden under his straw mattress, and the twins collected stones during their walks, piling them discreetly behind the door. Lucy, sensing Elisa's nervousness, clung to her even more, as if wanting to protect her with her own fragility. The baby cried more than usual, and Benjamin, still learning to speak, repeatedly asked where his father was. Elisa answered with invented stories, full of rivers and horses, where their father traveled to fetch stars. It was all she could give. At night, she sat on the porch with Noah beside her, looking at the road as if a miracle or an enemy could sprout from it. And then he came, not on a glorious morning, nor mounted on a white horse, but on a windy evening, his pants covered in dust, and his eyes weary from having seen too much that he would rather forget. Warren Walker was shorter than Richard, thinner, with a grizzled beard that seemed to have grown in the days of pain. He arrived walking slowly, without haste or imposition. Noah was the first to see him and ran to the road, stopping a few feet from the man. Elisa watched from the porch, her heart pounding with something that blurred between fear and relief. Warren took off his hat, looked at the boy, then at her. "I'm Richard's brother," he said, and then, looking at the almost fallen house, at the children scattered like seeds, he added, "From what I see, you already have everything he ever wanted." Elisa invited him in, but Warren preferred to sit outside, on the porch step, as the sun slowly died behind the hills. They talked like strangers sharing the same scar. She told him everything calmly: her arrival, the grief, the children, the notebook, the threat. He listened, in silence, merely nodding occasionally, as if recognizing the path even without having walked it. When she finished, she waited for some answer, a promise, a denial, perhaps a judgment. But he only said, "My brother always had a heart bigger than his judgment. If he trusted you, then I trust you too." And with that, he stood up and looked at the cabin. "But if we're going to face these men, we can't do it with rotten planks and hunger in our stomachs." The next day, the change began. With tools, borrowed from an acquaintance of Warren's in the village, they began to repair the cabin's structure. The roof was reinforced, the windows covered with pieces of old glass and thick fabric. The children, motivated by Warren's firm and silent presence, helped with everything they could, carrying buckets of water, clearing rubble, nailing boards under supervision. Noah, in particular, became attached to his new uncle with an almost reverent fervor. Elisa watched this with a lump in her throat. It was no longer just about survival. It was the reconstruction of something that had never fully existed. And without realizing it, she too leaned on Warren, not out of weakness, but because she was beginning to understand that strength could also be shared. Warren was the kind of man who spoke little, but whose gestures had the precision of someone who had had to mend more than roofs, broken hearts, shattered promises, heavy absences. At night, he made small repairs inside the house, while the children slept in almost absolute silence, as if they feared that any noise would bring back the graves. Elisa watched him with silent, still cautious admiration. At one point, as he repaired the door latch with a thick piece of leather, she approached and said, almost apologetically, "You didn't have to come." He paused for a moment, looked at her with tired eyes and replied, "Perhaps not. But there are things you do because it's right, not because it's easy, nor because it's convenient." That night, Elisa slept for the first time without fear that someone would break down the door. The following days were filled with hard work, but also small miracles. Lucy began to hum again while combing the twins' hair with her fingers. Samuel, always distant, surprised everyone by asking Warren to teach him how to use a hammer. The baby, previously restless, fell asleep in Elisa's lap for hours, as if finally finding a chest where the world stopped hurting. Agnes, with her sharp tongue and her heart hidden under layers of thorns, brought a live chicken as a gift. "It'll lay eggs. If it doesn't, at least it's soup." And she laughed, a rare sound that seemed to come from a previous life. The cabin, which once seemed like a tomb, began to feel like a home. And although fear still lingered, it now shared space with something new: hope. Warren's letter to the village notary, a man with a pompous voice and eyes that never watered, was met with disdain. An unregistered will? A woman from nowhere? 7 mouths that aren't hers? The man questioned, without even bothering to hide his contempt. Warren didn't answer. He simply left Richard's notebook on the table with the trembling handwriting at the bottom of the last page. "If anything happens to me, I leave this land, this home, and everything in it to Elisa, and may she care for my children as if they were her own." It had no legal value, but it carried the weight of what was rarest there: a given word. The notary, after much hesitation, signed an informal declaration of possession, which, although it did not shield Elisa from the grave's greed, gave her a paper with which to resist, and more importantly, something to show the village that she was not just an intruder, but part of a story. With the document in hand, Elisa went to the village general store with firm eyes. The stares followed her as always, some with scorn, others with pity, many with disguised fear. She bought some flour, soap, and cheap fabric, using the last coins she had earned working for Agnes. On her way out, she passed the house of the teacher who had previously scorned her and handed her a package of cookies made with the children. "They helped," she said. The woman hesitated, then accepted. She didn't say thank you, but the next day she appeared at the cabin with old books and used notebooks. Perhaps they want to learn to write, like their father. It was the first crack in the wall of indifference. Elisa didn't celebrate, but that night, washing her dirt-stained hands, she felt that the water seemed less cold. The books arrived like a silent spring. Abigail and Amelia were the first to plunge into the pages, reading aloud words they barely understood, laughing at the sounds, copying letters on the dirt floor with twigs. Samuel at first scoffed, but gradually drew closer, feigning disinterest while memorizing the stories. Noah read in silence, his brow furrowed and a broken pen between his fingers. One day, Elisa found him writing in his father's old notebook. "I'm just writing down what we did today," he said, without looking at her. She didn't insist, but that night, as she put the notebook away, she read the boy's words. "Today, Uncle Warren fixed the fence." Lucy fell but didn't cry. Elisa laughed loudly when Benjamin threw flour on her. "She looked like one of us." Elisa closed the notebook slowly, like someone guarding a warm secret within her chest. But not all days were light. Fear, like a stubborn shadow, still lingered in the pauses. The reinforced fence, the locked doors, the skinny dog that now roamed the house like a guard. Everything was preparation for what they knew was coming. And it came. 3 days after the notary signed the informal possession, the Graves brothers returned. 4 men, 2 on horseback, 2 with shotguns on their backs and arrogance in their eyes. They pounded on the door with clenched fists, demanding they leave. Elisa came out first. Behind her, Noah, Warren, and Samuel standing still. The twins and the little ones were kept inside, instructed not to look. One of the graves, the eldest, spat on the ground and pointed at Elisa. "This land has a debt, and the debt doesn't die with the debtor." Elisa, unmoved, held up the paper the notary had signed. "We're not afraid of you." The silence that followed was thick as mud. The Graves brothers laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. It was one of scorn, of those who see resistance as a game about to be won. The youngest of them, with scars on his arms and yellowed teeth, stepped forward. 3 days. After that, we'll come back with real men. We'll drag every one of you out of here, even if it's by rope." Warren crossed his arms, his eyes fixed on the man. "Try it," he said in a calm voice, but firm as river stone. The men spat on the ground again and mounted their horses. The sound of hooves echoed until it faded on the trail, leaving behind a smell of threat and dust. Elisa felt her body tremble, but she didn't succumb to fear. Noah turned to her and for the first time called her Mama. It was a whisper, almost accidental, but enough to make her eyes well up. That night, the cabin was in absolute silence, but no one slept. Every sound in the bush seemed to herald danger. Warren, with his father's inherited shotgun, kept vigil outside. Noah insisted on taking turns with him. Samuel, feigning bravery, slept on the floor with a piece of wood in his hands. Elisa stayed with the younger children, cuddling them on the makeshift mattress. Lucy clung to her neck and whispered, "Are you leaving too?" Elisa held her tight, like someone holding an anchor in a storm. No, never. The word hung in the air, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. But at that moment, in that instant, she believed, and the child did too. It was the first night none of them dreamed of abandonment. At dawn the next day, there was no time for discouragement. Warren organized the tools, few and worn, as if they were sacred weapons. Elisa assigned tasks as if leading a small army. Noah and Samuel would reinforce the fence. The twins would help with food. Lucy would take care of the baby. Everything had to be ready, not just to resist, but to affirm their belonging to that place. The floor was swept, the windows sealed with cloths, the well protected with boards. Every gesture was a silent cry. "We're not leaving." Agnes appeared, bringing stale bread and a box of rusty nails. "I can't give more, but I also can't watch you fall without doing anything." For the first time, Elisa hugged her. They stood there for a brief moment, silent, stitched by the same kind of pain, that of those who were forgotten, but decided not to disappear. Late that afternoon, the clouds hung heavy as lead over the rust-colored sky. A cold wind began to blow from the mountains, stirring up dust and foreshadowing a storm, not just of the weather, but of life. Warren called Noah aside. "They'll be back. Don't be fooled, but this time we're ready." The boy nodded firmly, clutching the hoe he would use for defense with both hands. Elisa, watching from a distance, felt a mixture of pride and fear. They were just children, and she, a woman without a strong surname, without the blood of that land. But there was something there that no paper, shotgun, or threat could tear away: belonging. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she knew that this night would be lived with dignity. And that at that moment was enough. In the darkness of the following night, when the storm finally broke, it wasn't just water that poured over the land. With it came the broken silence of those who had always been silenced. The cabin roof dripped in several corners, and Elisa, with a basin in hand, ran from side to side to prevent the water from soaking the children's blankets. Lucy, curled up beside her, didn't cry. She just watched her, with eyes so attentive that they seemed to be learning something about the world. The baby, nestled against Amelia's chest, slept with the serenity of one who ignores that battles are being fought outside. On the porch, Warren and Noah kept watch, soaked to the bone, their faces turned towards the trail. They waited for the Graves. But that night they didn't come. Perhaps the rain stopped them. Perhaps the fear of resistance had begun to grow. Or perhaps they knew that after that night, that cabin was no longer an easy place to take. The next day brought a timid sun, as if apologizing for the previous fury. The ground, now a quagmire, made any task difficult, but the feeling inside the house was different. There was a different silence, not of tension, but of survival. They had resisted. That, in itself, was a victory. Warren, his clothes still drying in the sun, smiled at Elisa for the first time with his eyes. "You're made of strong stuff, woman," he said, as he helped hang sheets on the makeshift clothesline. Elisa laughed, a light, almost forgotten sound. "I'm made of necessity. When you have no choice, you become courage." His smile remained. They both knew that what was beginning to emerge between them was more than relief. It was the seed of a love that didn't ask for permission or make grand promises. It simply grew firmly in the difficult terrain of life. That day, while washing clothes in the stream, Elisa thought of all she had left behind. The grey city, the musty boarding house room, the long days of silence. Within four walls, she remembered Richard's letters, the kind words and promises written with trembling letters. It was strange to think that without him, all this had become possible. There was no longer a dream of marriage, but there was something greater, purpose. By the stream, Abigail sat beside her and began to scrub a shirt, imitating her gestures with dedication. Elisa smiled, handing her another piece. Neither of them said anything, but there was a deep understanding between them, as if they shared a silent memory of women who carry the world with their hands. Meanwhile, Samuel dug a trench beside the old barn, helping Warren build a more secure fence. The boy sweated, his bare feet covered in mud, but he didn't complain. "He's stubborn like his father," Warren said, adjusting the stake. Samuel stared at him with narrowed eyes. "My father wouldn't let anyone take us from here." Warren nodded, respecting the boy's firmness. "And neither will you." The gesture was small, but strong. He put his arm around Samuel's shoulders and pulled him close, as if to say without words that he recognized in that boy not only his brother's blood, but the courage he had inherited. Samuel didn't pull away, and in that instant, something healed within him, not completely but enough to move forward. At night, while putting the younger ones to sleep, Elisa realized how each child had transformed in just a few days. Lucy, who used to cry at anything, now helped care for the baby with a tenderness that seemed instinctive. Amelia and Abigail created a kind of private language between them, made of glances and silent smiles, as if carrying each other in their hearts. Benjamin no longer threw tantrums upon waking, and even Noah, always reserved, began to trust, not so much in adults, but in the safe space they were beginning to build together. Elisa looked around and felt a strange peace. It wasn't lightness, it wasn't an absence of problems. It was the certainty of being where she was supposed to be, even if everything had started wrong. The pain still existed, but now there was something bigger occupying the space beside it. Meaning. Warren appeared at the door with a steaming iron pot. "Soup," he said with a timid pride. Elisa tasted the spoonful he offered and smiled. It was salty, with large, badly cut potato pieces, but it was the best soup she had ever tasted. They both sat on the doorstep, sharing the bowl and the silence. The sky was clear, studded with stars, that seemed to have descended a little closer to observe that small victory. "I didn't think you'd hold up," she confessed, not looking directly at him. "Neither did I," he replied simply, without heaviness in his voice. And in that moment, they weren't two broken people trying to support each other. They were two colliding worlds that had found refuge in each other. Not for what was missing, but for what they could still be. On the third day, as promised, the Graves brothers returned. They rode. Dirty horses dressed in worn leather clothes, their faces marked by sun and rancor. They stopped a few feet from the property entrance. and the eldest, Caleb, shouted without ceremony, "Time's up, woman! Get out now or we'll take you by force!" Elisa slowly stepped out of the cabin, her heart pounding as if it would explode. The children were hidden inside, as agreed. Warren remained by her side, firm. With a low voice but sharp as a knife, Elisa replied, "We have no intention of leaving, and we have the right to be here." Caleb laughed, a dry, mocking sound. Right died with Richard. But before he could continue, Noah appeared behind the fence with the notebook in his hands. "My father left this. He wrote it. It's signed. The land is ours." The boy held out the notebook as if it were a sacred weapon. Caleb dismounted with a look that mixed contempt and surprise. He took the notebook, leafed through the pages with dirty hands, and seeing his brother's name at the end of the text, he hesitated. The other two brothers exchanged glances. "This is worth nothing," he finally said, throwing the notebook to the ground. But there was a hesitation in his voice that did not go unnoticed. Warren took a step forward. "Try something, Caleb. Just try." The threat was clear. But more than the words, it was the stance of everyone that made a difference. Elisa, standing straighter than ever, the boys with sticks in their hands behind the fence, the fire in the eyes of those children. They were no longer vulnerable. They were a family standing tall. Caleb cursed something incomprehensible and mounted his horse. "This isn't over," he said before leaving. But deep down, everyone knew something had indeed ended there. Fear. When the horses disappeared around the bend in the road, the silence that remained was no longer one of terror, but of relief. Elisa bent down to pick up the notebook, now covered in dust. She carefully ran her hand over the cover, as if cleaning not only the object, but everything it symbolized, the last wish of a man who unknowingly had planted a seed of the future. Noah approached slowly. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked. Elisa looked at him tenderly. "Perhaps, but next time, we won't be afraid." She knelt and pulled the boy into a hug. It was a simple gesture, but in it was a mutual surrender. From then on, it was no longer just about surviving. It was about staying, about belonging to each other. Warren built a higher fence in the following days. He worked side by side with the boys, teaching them what he knew, but also learning from Noah's practical way, Samuel's strength, Abigail's silent curiosity. Elisa, in turn, found in Agnes a support network she never would have imagined. The old woman would come by with bags of stale bread, seeds, even an old kettle. "Some things are only saved with stubbornness," she would say, and Elisa would smile in return because she understood exactly what Agnes was talking about. The cabin, little by little, was transforming. The dust still existed and the precariousness too, but the place was beginning to feel like a home, and the most beautiful thing was that nothing there came easy. Everything was earned with effort, with small hands and tired but determined hearts. One muggy afternoon with a low sky, Elisa found Lucy trying to nurse the baby with a cloth doll. The girl whispered invented songs, rocking the child carefully. Elisa stood at the door for a few seconds, watching the scene with a lump in her throat. Lucy, with her big eyes and disheveled hair, didn't know she was too fragile for so much responsibility. Or perhaps she knew, and that's precisely why she was trying so hard. As she entered, Elisa knelt beside the two. "Do you want help?" she asked. Lucy nodded with a shy smile. Elisa took the baby in her arms and fed him with the improvised bottle, while Lucy rested her head on her shoulder. There, in the muggy heat of the cabin, something was born that Elisa couldn't name, but felt like a root digging deep into her chest. Belonging. At the end of that same day, with the sky orange and the smell of wet earth in the air, Warren sat beside Elisa on the wooden bench they had made together. "Do you ever think about going back to the city?" he asked, idly fiddling with a piece of string. Elisa took a long time to answer. She thought of the faceless streets, the empty jobs, the promises made and never kept. She thought of the nights when the silence was too cold and the mornings when her own body seemed unwilling to get up. "No," she said finally. "The city never saw me. Here, I exist." Warren turned his face to her and for the first time did not smile. Instead, he extended his hand and held hers firmly. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a pact, a silent recognition of two survivors who at last had stopped merely resisting and begun to live. The following days brought a new rhythm. For the first time, routines ceased to be urgent and became acts of care. There was water in the well, firewood stacked against the wall, vegetables beginning to sprout in the crooked garden beds that Elisa and the children cultivated with their hands. Each meal was still simple, but made with dignity. Bread baked in an iron pot, cooked roots, thick broths. In the morning, Samuel trained the old farm dog to protect the entrance, while the twins collected flowers and created secret names for them. At night, Noah read aloud from his father's notebook, not just the will, but lists of things Richard planned to do, hand-drawn maps, loose phrases. It became almost a ritual. It was as if, in some way, Richard's presence remained alive there, guiding them through the shards of what was left. One day, while washing clothes by the stream, Elisa heard footsteps behind her. She turned with a tight heart, fearing the return of the graves. But it was a woman, a stranger, thin as a dry branch, with a scarf tied around her head, and eyes that had seen more winters than springs. "Are you Richard's woman?" she asked without preamble. Elisa confirmed with a nod, without lowering her gaze. The woman introduced herself as Miriam, an old friend of the children's mother. "I heard about you at the store. They said you stayed despite everything." She extended a bundle: flour, beans, and a piece of soap. "I can't give much, but no one who faces the graves deserves to go hungry." Elisa held the gift with trembling hands. In that instant, she understood that the strength of a community sometimes begins with the gesture of a single person who decides not to turn away. Miriam's gesture spread like a breeze through open windows. In a few days, Elisa began to find small donations left at the cabin's entrance: a dozen eggs wrapped in newspaper, a bag of potatoes, even a child's wool blouse with crooked stitches, but made with care. Nothing came with names, but everything bore the silent mark of people who, though afraid, were beginning to recognize in that woman and those children something stronger than the grave's threat. In the village, the previously suspicious gazes became longer, less harsh. Elisa still faced closed doors, but now some were ajar. It was as if her presence there had begun to move the ground beneath others too, as if the simple fact that she hadn't fled this forgotten corner of the world said something everyone needed to hear. One cold morning, the baby fell ill. The fever came suddenly, his face red and his body too limp in Elisa's arms. She ran to the village without thinking, her eyes desperate, her body exhausted. She knocked on the doctor's door, the one who had ignored her in the first days. "It's a child," she said, tearless, only urgency. The old doctor hesitated, looked around, and finally let her in. In the simple room, he examined the baby and murmured, "It's just a high fever. It will pass." Elisa stood there, watching every movement, her heart beating to the rhythm of the child's breathing. When she returned home, she carried a bottle of medicine, a clean cloth, and above all the feeling that something had been gained, not with shouts or pleas, but with the indomitable strength of one who loves without measure. That night, as the baby slept with a cool forehead and peaceful breathing, Elisa sat outside, wrapped in the wool shawl Agnes had given her. The breeze was cold, but the sky was clear, studded with stars so bright they seemed to be trying to say something. Warren joined her, bringing 2 cups of warm tea made with leaves the twins had collected. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crickets, feeling the exhaustion of their bodies mixed with gratitude for another day overcome. "I never thought you'd stay," he said without looking directly at her. Elisa smiled, her eyes on the darkness of the woods. "Neither did I. But sometimes you only know what you're capable of when there's nowhere left to run." He nodded slowly, as if understanding more than he said. The following days were filled with hard work and renewal. With every small advancement, a reinforced wall, a new corn seedling growing, a bucket of milk obtained with the help of a brave neighbor, the feeling that they were rebuilding not just a house, but themselves grew stronger. Samuel stopped responding with anger. Instead, he began to laugh at Warren's stories, helping with the axe and asking about the times he hunted with his brother. Abigail and Amelia created a book of dried leaves where they glued flowers and wrote invented stories. Lucy now slept clinging to Elisa's hip, as if she knew that there no one else would leave her alone. Even Noah, the most reserved, allowed himself to play by pushing an old wheel down a hill, letting out a laugh that made Elisa stop what she was doing, and for a moment just observe, like witnessing a discreet but immense miracle. But like all calm in the countryside, peace was just the interval between two storms. On the morning of the 5th Saturday since Elisa's arrival, a heavy wagon appeared on the dirt road, stirring up dust and silence. Noah was the first to see it. He ran to the porch and called for Elisa, who came out with her apron stained with flour and her hands still full of dough. The Graves brothers were back. 2 men, dark clothes, eyes hard as chipped stone. This time, they weren't giving warnings. They were talking about possession. They said they came with documents, that they would fence the lands the next day, that everything there was now theirs. Elisa didn't answer immediately. She looked at the children, because that's what she already called them in her thoughts, and then at Warren, who appeared behind her like an iron shadow. "You'll have your answer tomorrow," she said, firm, her voice more secure than her own body. The night that followed was filled with contained tension. While the children slept, Elisa, Warren, and Noah gathered around Richard's old notebook. On the table, Warren pointed to the last page. There, written in his brother's crooked and hurried handwriting, was the note that changed everything. "If I don't return, I leave this land and everything in it to the care of Elisa Henderson, so that she may raise my children with the love I wish to give." It wasn't a legal will, but it was a testimony, and more, it was a story. In that land, story still held some value. They decided that at sunrise, they would take the notebook to the local judge in Clearwater. They didn't know if he would listen, but they knew they could no longer live in fear. That night, Elisa didn't sleep. She sat at the head of the cradle, watching over the baby, as if she knew she was about to face not only men, but the ghosts of abandonment, injustice, and loss. The sun rose red, tinging the sky with a color that seemed like a premonition. Elisa tied her hair with a simple scarf and put on her best dress, which was still old, faded, with mismatched buttons. Warren saddled the horse with steady hands, and Noah, his eyes too alert for a 12-year-old boy, held the notebook against his chest, like someone carrying a relic. They arrived in Clearwater as the town was still waking up, with dogs barking and chapel bells chiming 8. The judge received them reservedly. He was a small man, with tiny eyes and an impatient manner. He read the notebook with skepticism, running his fingers over the page as if searching for something invisible. "It's not official," he finally said. Elisa, her hands on the table, replied, "But it is true." The silence that followed seemed too long. Finally, the judge sighed. "The law isn't always fair, miss, but sometimes if you listen closely, it tries to be." That same day, the judge called an informal hearing in the small wooden room that served as a courthouse. The Graves brothers were there, indignant, spitting arguments and demands. But they weren't expecting Elisa standing tall, her gaze calm, nor Warren by her side, nor Noah holding that notebook with the posture of a legitimate heir. Richard's words, read aloud, echoed through the space like a last gesture from someone who was no longer there, but still protected. The judge, with a visible weight in his words, declared that until the dispute was formally resolved, the land would remain under Elisa's guardianship as a measure of good faith. The Graves left grinding their teeth, but without victory. When they returned home, the sun was already beginning to set, gilding the fields. Elisa didn't celebrate aloud, but as she crossed the fence gate, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, the feeling of belonging somewhere. That night, the cabin was warmer, not just from the fire crackling in the wood stove, but from the warmth that came from the center of the room, where everyone gathered, crowded, yet together. Samuel played an old harmonica he had found among Richard's things. Amelia and Abigail danced, barefoot on the floorboards, and Lucy laughed with eyes half closed from sleep. Elisa sat on the floor, the baby in her lap, and for the first time in a long time allowed herself to simply observe, not as one who watches, but as one who contemplates something rare. Warren handed her a cup of tea, and as he touched her hand, there was something tender there, not urgent, but solid, a silent bond made of admiration and care. In that instant she knew this was love, not the dreamt of love from the letters Richard had written, but a love born of dust, resistance, and dirt-stained hands. The following days brought more work, of course, because life there left no room for comfort, but they also brought a new rhythm. The fence was reinforced. An improvised chicken coop began to take shape with leftover wood. Elisa started teaching the children to read and write at night, using pieces of charcoal and yellowed papers that Miriam occasionally sent. Each one took on a role in that small mechanism. Noah cared for the animals, Samuel made repairs, the twins took care of the garden and clothes, and Lucy became the attentive eyes of the house, always noticing what was missing before anyone else. It was a dissonant orchestra, but alive. And despite the absences of the father who didn't return, of the life that wasn't, there was presence there, presence of purpose, of choices made and remade, of roots that, though still fragile, were beginning to take hold in the soil. One especially silent late afternoon, Elisa found Lucy sitting under the fallen tree in the back of the property with a lost look among the dry leaves. She approached slowly, sitting beside the girl who didn't say a word. They stayed there, just breathing the same air, until Lucy murmured, "Are you leaving too?" Elisa swallowed hard, her heart tightening as if she had heard the lament of all the losses in that place. "I'm not," she replied, looking at the pink sky that was beginning to fade. "Even if it hurts, even if it's difficult, I chose to stay." Lucy slowly turned, resting her head on Elisa's shoulder as if finally letting go of the weight of ancient fear. In that small gesture, Elisa understood that trust for a wounded child was like a flower in the desert, rare, precious, and profoundly fragile. The next morning they found footprints in the mud around the house. Warren carefully examined them and concluded that the Graves were lurking. The silent warning hung in the air like smoke, but no one spoke of fear. Elisa gathered everyone in the living room and explained the situation frankly. "We are here because we have the right, and we will not yield." Samuel was the first to stand up, crossing his arms, defiant. "If they come, we'll protect what's ours." And with that, the others also rose, each in their own way. The cabin became a trench. They boarded up the windows, stocked food, prepared buckets of water and tools within reach. It wasn't courage that moved this improvised family, but the certainty that they had become something no document could deny. They belonged to each other, and when you belong, you don't run. You resist. The threat materialized on a strong, windy dawn. The front door shook violently, and the cracking sound of breaking wood was the first sign. Warren was already on his feet, an old shotgun in his hands, but it was the firmness in his face that was more frightening. Noah, knife in hand, positioned himself behind the back door. Elisa picked up Benjamin and ran to hide the baby and Lucy in the trapdoor under the floor, covering them with blankets and dried corn. The sound of heavy footsteps invaded the house like thunder. But the Graves didn't expect resistance. They didn't expect a woman and a group of children to rise like walls. Warren shouted, his voice like thunder, "Take another step at your own risk." Outside, a tense silence hung, and then one of them spoke, harsh and mocking. "This house isn't yours." Elisa, firm, replied, "Perhaps it wasn't, but it is now, and we won't leave." The minutes that followed felt like hours. One bolder step from the invaders, and Warren fired into the air, the gunpowder echoing like a dry lightning strike in the dark sky. The children screamed, not in panic, but in resistance. Samuel threw stones through the windows, the twins pulled planks to barricade the entrance, and Noah, with blazing eyes, stood as a sentinel, protecting the younger ones with his own body. The Graves, confused by such bravery, hesitated. One of them, younger, retreated. The other shouted that they would return, that this wouldn't end there. But when they left, leaving boot prints in the mud and promises in the air, the house remained standing. Elisa, trembling, descended to the trapdoor, where Lucy awaited her with tear-filled eyes. "Did we win?" the girl asked. Elisa hugged her tight, her face against the fine hair. "For today, yes. And sometimes, that's all we need." The next morning, the sun appeared, timidly, as if also tired from the night. The cabin smelled of gunpowder and sweat, but there was a respectful silence in the air, a silence of those who had survived. Miriam arrived shortly after noon, riding her stubborn mule, bringing a basket with bread, jerky, and a bottle of medicine. Seeing the state of the house, she muttered a quiet curse, then narrowed her eyes to hold back tears. "You did what no one else here had the courage to do," she said, looking at Elisa as one sees a rare thing. "You stayed." Elisa smiled, tired, and replied simply, "Because there was nowhere else to go." In that instant, there was no heroism in the air, only truth. A harsh, naked truth, but full of meaning. Miriam's presence brought not only food, but a new certainty. They were not as alone as they seemed. As the days passed, the story of their resistance spread through the village like dust carried by the wind. People who had previously ignored them began to appear with small offerings: a chicken, a sack of corn, an old axe. None of this was enough to immediately change their lives, but each gesture was a sign that the land was beginning to accept them, inch by inch. Elisa still went to work at Agnes's house twice a week, and the old woman, with her keen gaze, observed everything without commenting much. One day, as they sewed together in the afternoon light, Agnes said, "You are building a home with your own hands. No one can take that from you." Elisa didn't answer. She only smiled with her eyes, because she knew it was true. It no longer mattered if that land had begun as a promise or a mistake. Now, it was home. And that was more than any paper could say. One afternoon, while cleaning Richard's old cupboard to turn it into a bookshelf, Noah found a leather notebook hidden under a loose board. The pages were stained with time, with the firm, hurried handwriting of a man who knew time was slipping away. It was the will. There, in simple words, Richard left the house, the land, and everything he owned to his children, and if he could not raise them, to Elisa Henderson, the woman who chose to come. Elisa read it standing, her hands trembling and her heart tight. This was the first time she had seen her name written by Richard with purpose, with faith. "He knew," she murmured, as if speaking to the past. Warren looked at her in silence, then took off his hat and held it against his chest in a sign of respect. "Now, no one else can take this from you." Elisa closed the notebook gently, as if sealing a promise already fulfilled. With the document in hand, they went to the county seat, accompanied by Miriam and Warren. The road was long and dusty, but the journey felt lighter. The clerk, a man with harsh features and ink-stained fingers, read the notebook and nodded. "This is sufficient." He gave them a receipt, a stamp, and an almost imperceptible smile. On the way back, Elisa sat in the wagon and looked at the dry fields bordering the road. It wasn't easy. It wasn't an easy life, but it was a life. And above all, it was theirs. Noah held the reins with the firmness of one who had learned more than any 12-year-old boy should know. Warren walked beside the wagon, his step rhythmic, like one who chose to stay. Elisa leaned her head against the wooden side and closed her eyes for a moment. For the first time in many years, she felt safe. That night, they all sat together for dinner. The table was still crooked and the plates uneven. But there was warm food, free laughter, and hands held before they began. Benjamin smeared his chin with porridge. Lucy said she would teach the baby to say "mama," and the twins rehearsed a song they had invented for Elisa. Samuel, always a bit reserved, now joked with the naturalness of someone who had discovered he could be a child again. Noah, though still bearing the weight of too much loss, smiled with his eyes, discreetly but truthfully. Elisa watched it all with a heart full of something she couldn't name. It was joy, yes, but it was more than that. It was belonging. It was the miracle of having come to the edge of the abyss and instead of falling, finding other outstretched arms and extending her own as well. Later, sitting on the porch with Warren, as the sky filled with stars and crickets told their secrets to the night, Elisa felt a peace she had never known. It wasn't full happiness, the kind that lasts little and burns quickly. It was something else, something deeper, more enduring. "I never thought I'd stay," she said without looking at him. "Neither did I," Warren replied with a short smile. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was like a shared blanket. Elisa rested her head on his shoulder, unhurried, without promises, just presence. And in that simple, unheralded gesture, something was sealed. It wasn't the beginning of a grand romance, like in the books Elisa used to read during breaks from work in Boston. It was the beginning of a real partnership, made of mud, bread, silence, and struggle, and that was much rarer and much truer. The following days brought more work, of course, because life there left no room for luxuries, but they also brought a new rhythm. The fence was raised with reclaimed wood and the help of neighbors who, little by little, began to draw closer. Miriam brought seeds. Agnes sent an old oven that still worked. Even the pastor of the small Clearwater church appeared with a bucket of white paint and offered to help paint. "The cabin, it's not much, but it brightens what's possible," he said. Elisa smiled with gratitude, but kept her suspicion deep in her chest, like someone who knows that trust in that land is cultivated like corn, with patience, sweat, and a little luck. However, each gesture was a crack in the wall of hostility, and seeing the children helping, Noah sawing planks, Samuel wielding the hammer with pride, the twins painting hearts on the windows, made Elisa understand with sharp clarity that the new life would not come ready-made, but it was already being born there, day after day. One afternoon, when the rain fell gently, like a warm blessing on the dry land, Elisa took Lucy for a walk through the field. The girl's feet sank into the light mud, and she giggled with every puddle she stepped in. "Are you going to stay here forever?" she asked suddenly, her eyes shining with hope. Elisa knelt before her, ran her hand through the wet curls, and said, "As long as you want me to stay, I'll stay." It was a simple promise, without paper, without ceremony, but made with the kind of love that resists everything. Lucy then took a crumpled flower from her pocket and placed it behind Elisa's ear. "Now you're really part of our family," she said, with the conviction of one who knows how to recognize what is essential. Elisa smiled with tears in her eyes. She didn't need anything more. There, in that instant, she knew she had found what she had been searching for. It wasn't Richard, nor security. It was real love, the kind that chooses to stay. When spring finally arrived, it wasn't with grand flowers or celebrations. It came in the details. in the timid green sprouting near the restored well, in the smell of baking bread in the cabin, in the carefree laughter of children running in the yard. Elisa, who used to walk hunched by the weight of doubt, now walked with her chin held high. She had learned to tend the land, to improvise repairs, to recognize fevers by hot cheeks, and to hear the babies cry as if deciphering a secret language. But more than that, she had learned that home is not made of fulfilled promises, but of people who stay. And she had stayed, against death, against abandonment, against the Graves brothers, against everything. It was this permanence that made the cabin a sacred place, not for its beauty, but for its history. On the porch, where she once sat waiting for a fiancé who would never arrive, Elisa now sewed small socks, taught the twins to embroider, and laughed with Warren, who brought firewood and stories of a time when he still believed he belonged to no one. They had built something stronger than blood together, a family by choice, united not by obligation, but by affection. When the sun set behind the field and tinged everything with warm orange, Elisa sometimes found herself thinking of the woman who had stepped off that train months ago, fragile, hopeful, starved for a place in the world. Now, sitting there, surrounded by voices, clutter, and life she knew, this was not the ending she expected, but it was the beginning she needed. And however improbable it was, this was her story, and she wouldn't trade it for any other. In the last scene of that long cycle, a forgotten letter fell from an old book. It was from Richard, written before his death. In it, he said, "If you are reading this, it is because I had less time than I would have liked. But if you stayed, Elisa, know that I am grateful. I asked for a chance to give my children a home. Perhaps God understood that differently and sent someone to be that home." Elisa read in silence, sitting on the floor, surrounded by the children's improvised toys. The words carried a tender weight. For the first time she cried for Richard, not for lost love, but for gratitude, because unknowingly he had given her the most improbable gift, a new beginning. And so, with her feet firm on the earth and her heart softened by struggle, Elisa found her true story. It wasn't about fleeing loneliness, but about embracing the unexpected. It wasn't about being a wife, but about being a root, a harbor, a nest. What was born there, in that ruined cabin, was more than a reconstructed home. It was a family, built on the courage to stay when it would have been easier to leave. And whoever looked from the outside might only see an ordinary woman with children and a quiet man on the porch. But whoever knew it from within would know there resided a love forged in grief, in dust and in shared bread, and for that very reason unbreakable.